What fairy queen depiction can be complete without a wardrobe of flowing, elegant gowns? I've been asked a question on how I draw and paint cloth, so I'm going to be showing you some tricks in this tutorial on that subject. I'm going to be addressing it in two parts. In the first part, I will discuss the drawing of figures in flowy clothing, and then after that, I'll go into the painting with a demonstration of cloth and gowns in watercolors. Now, while having an actual dress to use on a model would be ideal, a lot of times, as a fantasy artist working from your imagination is required because we don't have the resources to have all the fantastic props that you might want to paint and draw. But fortunately for us, imagination can get you pretty far. And I'm going to show you a few of the tricks that I use to accomplish this. I'm going to show you the wonders and joys of a plain white bed sheet as reference material when drawing cloth and painting clothing. Well, first of all, using a sheet draped on the back of a chair is a very classic exercise for artists to study light, study reflection, and a white bed sheet is best for this because you get the most of the shadows and the light and the reflection hitting it and surrounding ambient colors. But as far as clothing goes, you can do a lot with a bed sheet. Look at the way this drapes on my arm, okay? Imagine this. This can be easily turned into a flowing sleeve on some fantasy character that you're drawing. Look at the way the lines of the cloth, the weight of it pulls down from here, the way there are these folds along the edges, the small little crinkles that happen, even the translucence right now with the window backlighting me. You can actually see through it in places like that. You can see the shadow of my arm through here, right? And how the folds are more opaque in the sections that are folded over. And look at the way that the lines of these folds and gravity causes it to have this nice curve when I pull up portions of it. The other thing to take note of are these angles. Cloth isn't, when it drapes, it isn't just a straight round curve. What happens is you get these crinkled edges and angles, and it's key to take note of that when you are starting to draw then. So this is a good place to start, to look for reference and to see the way cloth hangs and the way it moves and flows and can be twisted up, right? All these different things are elements that you can integrate into pictures as you are painting and drawing from your imagination, and you can always go back to reference, find another sheet to use and twist it up or drape it on something in a similar fashion to what you are working with. Let's take a look at that bed sheet again in some photos and talk about some of the visible keys to keep in mind when you are subsequently working from your imagination. So here's a photo that I took, and one of the things that I want you to take note of, I'm going to add a lighter layer here just so that I can do paint over and point out certain aspects. So one of the first things to notice is the line of the draping. As I mentioned before, when I was in motion and not on the screen, what you're not going to see is a smooth arc like this when it comes to drapery. You're not going to see lines that just go like that. That's kind of a shortcut, but it's not what really happens. Now, what you really see instead are these very angular types of curves. They are curves, but they're not smooth ones because gravity is working and pulling the cloth in towards the ground, right? And it's going to pull it at certain points depending on where the weight is distributed and how it's falling off of the body. So while some places will be smooth and straight lines, most of the lines that you see are going to be these angled, and they're going to have points to them, right? It's not just smooth curves. So that's the first thing to take note of. Next up is transparency. Transparency and translucence. In this picture, what you can see is this section over here. You know, that is a fold, and so it's sort of like a doubled up layer, as well as these sections right here, right? Everything, actually most of this. So the translucent parts that we see are right here, and right here, and sometimes over here. This is with a backlit situation like this. And the deepest shadowy areas are going to be the places where the folds are thickest, right? All along these areas, as well as where my arm is underneath the cloth. And of course, where the body is later. Right now we're just discussing the arm area. So the result of having those translucent areas is that you get sort of this light airiness to the cloth, especially if you're going to be depicting something like silk or a light linen, something that's thin and semi-translucent. You want to keep in mind these transparency and translucent elements, especially if you have very bright lighting coming in around your picture. Again, over here, we see a lot of angles in the flow of this curve, especially right here. You see, look at this. This is a very sharp V, in fact, of that fold. What you do not see, it is not just the smooth curve. If you do that, then you lose a lot of the reality of the cloth, and it looks a little bit more cartoonish. So you really want to think about these angles. Weight is pulling down right over here, right? This is where the majority of the weight of the cloth is sort of gathering. That's the heaviest point, because over here I'm supporting some of it with my hand, and up here it's being supported by my wrist as well as the whole upper surface of my arm. So anything that's falling and draping, the weight ends up being gathered in these lower points. And that's what creates these angled little nooks and things that you see in the cloth. Next up, let's look at tension. So here's another photo. And what we get with this is this lovely tension that's moving. Get this motion of the cloth being pulled up tight by my hand over here, as well as where it wraps around my body. So these are the two tension points. You have tension point 1 over here, tension point 2 over here. Now I drew these as smooth curves just now, counter to what I was just telling you before. Although for the most part, you know, this is a very smooth line. The one angle break we have is right here as it comes around the body. We have a little bit of an angle right there as well. But this line, this long flowing line that moves up from my hip to my hand, that is a nice smooth one. And that really pulls it, that really gives a sense of tension and pull and weight when you get these kinds of lines. You also have some tension going from, so the weight, right, is being supported right there by my hand, but it pulls down. So we have this, we have these lines of tension coming up here, as well as these lines of tension moving down now as the cloth drapes from my hand, and the weight of gravity is pulling everything downwards. Now you can see over here, this is not a smooth curve either. What we get are these kinds of lines. Unless the cloth is extremely heavy, these lines will not be completely straight. The heavier your cloth is, the straighter these lines will be, because gravity is just going to pull it flat and pull everything down to the ground. If you have a very light, airy cloth, if, for example, this was silk instead of cotton, or a wind was blowing, then what we might get instead would be, you know, these sort of airy drifting of the cloth as it was blown about, because it's not as heavy. But these lines would still have the tension coming up from the hip, because that's not gravity here now. Well, gravity is at work over here, but this upward motion is happening because of my hand pulling the cloth in that direction. Finally, this last piece, this last photo, what I wanted to look at was more of the smaller bits of tension. Now, this is not as dramatic as the previous photo where my hand was out and pulling the cloth out to my side. This is something that has not so much free material flowing and moving, but you're still going to see tension and crinkles. We see all these little bits over here. We see this tiny little curve of cloth. All of this happens because the body is not a straight cylinder. If it was flat, then there would be no crinkles. Instead, what we have, well, more or less, right? We have a lot of form that the cloth has to bunch and gather at. So there's going to be more gathering at the waist. There's going to be more of taut pull in the wider areas, such as the hips and the bust. So these crinkles over here, this is caused by the gathering and bunching of the cloth. All of this stuff happening in this section. And then you see over at the hip, because this is again wider, there's going to be a much smoother line right here, as well as in the upper bust area. This is where the cloth is very smooth in this section. You see, I'm just going to outline it right there. Whereas over here, there's a lot more crinkles and things. So you got to keep in mind that too as you shape your cloth around whatever figures you have. So those are just some key points to keep in mind as you work. You can always go back and create references of yourself really easily. As you saw, this is just me playing around with a bed sheet, and there's just a whole lot that you can simulate with it in order to have some basic reference material. Once you have that, then you can start, and once you have an understanding of the play of tension and the drape and the movement, then you can start to use your imagination in order to craft these things. There we have the first installment on this topic. It's going to be maybe one or two more videos about this, as I continue next month to move on to applying these concepts that I talked about into drawings. Meanwhile, as you wait for that, why don't you pull out a bed sheet and do some studies of your own on the movement and draping of cloth. This topic was brought about by a question requesting cloth by Trish on my Discord channel that my Patreon backers have access to hang out with me on. Thank you so much to all of you. I really appreciate it so much. If you'd also like to support the creation of more videos like this and to be part of the chat and community, please come and check out on www.patreon.com/Stephanie Law. I'd love to have you join, and there's just so much information that everyone contributes to and that I love sharing with you guys here on YouTube as well as my Patreon backers. So I hope you come and check it out, and I hope you enjoyed this video today. Thank you very much for joining.